Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. Today, we're going to talk about some of the 1980s aircraft handling features that were added to the Iowa-class battleships. Right now, I am in Onrush Tower. This is Battleship New Jersey's flight control tower that was added in 1982 at the Long Beach Naval Shipyard. Onrush was Battleship New Jersey's code name when talking to aircraft over the radio telephone, like this one right here. So I am sitting in the flight control officer's chair. He would be an officer and he would be a pilot who was not so much assigned to the ship as assigned to whichever squadron of aircraft was assigned to the ship, assuming that the ship had an aircraft assigned. Now, typically in the 80s, Iowa-class battleships did not have aircraft assigned. They had the flight deck, but that was more for receiving aircraft from other ships. Battleships never had hangars for any of their aviation assets, so they couldn't do a lot of maintenance work. And so even though they could receive helicopters and they had fuel for helicopters, they typically didn't carry them as assigned. There is parking for at least 3 aircraft in addition to the landing pad. Let's see, what else do we have here in flight control? Well, we have our windshields for if it's raining. The U.S. Navy can conduct flight ops at nighttime and in adverse weather. Let's see, you can see behind me here how this room was grafted onto the after Mark 37 Director Tower. So this was an exterior space up until 1982, and then they just added it on here. Many of the spaces on Battleship New Jersey, I won't say all of them, but most of them are designed with 2 ways in and out. So if there's an emergency and the doorway, which is behind where the camera is right now, is blocked and I cannot escape from here, there is a ladder with a hatch going out the top. It's pretty functionally useless for anything else, but as an emergency escape hatch, it's pretty great. In addition to the flight control officer, there could be a second person working in here with a grease pencil. Notice I've got a stool here behind the status board. And from back here, I can update tracking information, contacts that we're receiving, and we've got the communication equipment all around the space to communicate with other parts of the ship and aircraft coming in. So right outside the door to the control tower, on the O2 level back aft on the starboard side, we have the battleship's glide slope indicator. This would help pilots on approach line up to the battleship's flight deck. During the 1980s, New Jersey had 2 separate approach patterns. There was the one that was initially installed, which had this facing off to starboard. It allowed aircraft, or directed aircraft, to land diagonally from the starboard fantail onto the flight deck of the ship. So a lot of pictures you see from the early 80s show the flight deck with a white diagonal slash going down it. Well, at some point in the mid-80s, as they recommissioned the other Iowas and they got more experience operating these ships, they figured out that, hey, it's a lot simpler to just come up on approach directly behind your ship and line up on her wake and touch down than it is to come in on a diagonal. So at some point they changed that, and they must have decided that whatever equipment was back at the fantail that they were worried about helicopters getting called on was a non-issue. So as you see the fantail today, it has a straight line going down the back that the helicopter would line up on. And we are portraying the ship as she would have appeared around the year 1990 when this was how it was used. So the glide slope indicator is now set up to face the stern of the ship directly instead of off at an angle. So now we are inside the Cayman Sea Sprite that Battleship New Jersey has on display. These helicopter sounds are very appropriate for what it would have sounded like here on board. I won't say that's the reason why this location was chosen for Battleship New Jersey, but we're right between heliports, one in Camden and one across in Philadelphia, so we're constantly getting buzzed so that visitors can get the full 1980s experience here on the battleship. Anyway, the Cayman Sea Sprite, is one of two main types of aircraft that New Jersey would have operated during the 1980s. This one operated off of New Jersey a lot in the earlier 80s and was largely phased out by the ubiquitous UH-60 Blackhawks, or Seahawks as they're called in the Navy, that you still see in use today. Now, other larger aircraft, like the CH-47 Chinooks, also landed on board at times or conducted UNREP operations back here. But this is the one that the museum has on loan that you can come out and see today. So we got the foot pedals here, we got the joysticks here, the pilots and co-pilots are attached. It's got an overhead hook so we can lower down to pick people up or lower cargo. We've also got a dipping sonar on here. Battleship New Jersey doesn't have its own indigenous sonar or anti-submarine capacity, but the helicopters which could have operated on board did carry dipping sonars, sono buoys, and could carry acoustic homing torpedoes. And we got another video on some of our aviation where we talk a little bit about that, so be sure to check that one out too. Notice if I want to make a quick escape, I'm all buckled in, I just have to pop that lever and everything comes apart. So now we're standing on the flight deck. During World War II through the Vietnam War, this would have been wood, and the aircraft would have just landed right on the wood deck. In the 1980s, they built a raised metal structure for the aircraft to land on. Here you can see the pattern. It's got the line down the center that the helicopter would line up on going aft to fore. That's the late 80s version as opposed to the diagonal one, which you might see in earlier pictures. And you can also see the big meatball in the center here, which is where the helicopter would be touching down. Or if they're just doing an UNREP, where they would be trying to drop their cargo. Iowa-class battleships doing underway replenishment could receive foodstuffs, they could receive ammunition, basically anything they needed, with the exception of fuel, could be delivered by helicopter. UNREP was pioneered by the US Navy during World War II and is now used by them around the world, and no other Navy comes close to our capacity to transport cargo to forward deployed areas and get it on ships and maintain those ships on station. So at the aft end of the flight deck here is where the drone capturing net would be hung. Like I said, it's a giant volleyball net in theory, and it's mounted on tall removable posts, and the drone pilot would come out on deck from the normal drone control station and use a joystick to bring the drone in. And he's just trying to crash that drone into the net so that it can be recovered. He can't do drone recovery and helicopter recovery at the same time because the net fouls the landing area. So it is removable. It can be pulled out when the helicopters are coming in. Now we are under the barrels of turret number 3. Because of the propeller shafts in the hull, turret number 3 is raised a little bit higher than turret number 1, though not superimposed like turret number 2. That leaves enough room under the barrels to store something. Obviously, the guns can't depress and fire right here. So, in the late 80s, when the Iowa-class battleships were equipped with some of the first military drones, AAI's RPV Pioneer, or remotely piloted vehicle, the hangars which housed the RPVs were tied down using the aviation tie-down points right here under turret 3. And it was basically a pair of Connex boxes next to each other, and they were designed to hold up to 8 RPVs, although I believe only 5 were ever carried. And as far as I know, there were only 2 squadrons of these deployed. So there was an Iowa in both, there were 2 Iowas in the Pacific, New Jersey and Missouri, and there were 2 Iowas in the Atlantic, Iowa, and then replaced by Wisconsin. So whichever one was forward deployed at the time would have the drone squadron attached. They would pick up the Connex boxes and drop it on that one. And whichever one was not deployed, back in port getting work done, would not have the drone squadron attached. So New Jersey and Iowa test these squadrons, go back into port, and then Missouri and Wisconsin have the squadrons embarked when they deploy for the Gulf War. And that is some of the most famous use of drone technology, was those actions by the drones supporting the Iowa-class battleships. The RPVs could be stored in segments with a fuselage and the wing coming off the top. They had a wooden pusher propeller, and I exaggerate slightly, but basically a lawnmower engine that powered them. They were launched via a rocket that would detach after it pushed the aircraft into the air, and they were recovered via basically a giant volleyball net, which would be mounted on the stern of the ship. Their job was the same as the spotter planes of World War II. They could spot the fall of shot from the big guns and transmit targets back using cameras and infrared sensors, so that the 16-inch guns could target objects over the horizon beyond visual range, see where their shells landed, and adjust. So, we are now in the ground control station, which was added in the mid-80s for controlling the drones. This is on the O2 level, starboard side, in part of what used to be the gunnery office on New Jersey. Each of the Iowas received slightly different upgrades in the 80s, and I'm not convinced that they all had the drone control station in the same place. So initially, this whole space and the other half of this bulkhead was a gunnery office. At some point, probably around 85 or 86, this part of the wall, which used to be an archway, received a real thin sheet metal covering pop riveted on. So the other side became the 5-inch gunnery office, and then this side was modified for electronics equipment, which is why you see the rubberized linoleum decking below me. And this became the ground control station where the drones were piloted from. I believe the equipment in this space was removed to be taken onto whichever Iowa was operating the drone squadron at the time, just like the removable hangars. You can still see some of the communications equipment that the pilots had to talk with other surface ships, but otherwise, there's nothing but weld marks to tell what this space used to be. Here's a picture of what a drone control station looked like on the Iowa-class battleships. And I'm not sure where that console specifically was set up in here, although if I had to bet it would be somewhere around this workbench here, because we got a lot of power running across. Now, this space is currently used by our radio club, and you can see a lot of the electronics here that they work on to make our ship seem alive. If you're interested in volunteering, shoot me an email. The battleship's use of drones was relatively short-lived, just a couple of years in the late 80s, because the battleships were decommissioned by 1992. Well, initially, when they were reactivated, the plan was, starting around 1993, to start upgrading these ships again. Their power plants required a lot of work, and they wanted to remove the armored box launchers and replace them with vertical launch tubes. And at that time, there were plans to add a more purpose-built drone hangar under Turret 2. Rather than just using Connex boxes, it was going to be an actual prefab structure, but it was still going to be removable. However, in that brief half-decade window that these Iowas were operating the drones, they did get some notable use during the Gulf War. By that point, they'd been training on these ships for a couple of years, and the Navy knew how to use them, and they had been well integrated with the battleships. So the drones spotted the fall of shot going into Iraq and Kuwait, targeting the Iraqi army. The guns were so accurate and so devastating, and the RPVs flew so low and so brazenly that the Iraqis could hear their motors overhead, and when they heard that, they knew that bombardment from the battleships was impending. So on one occasion, Mizora had just finished shelling an Iraqi-held island, and Wisconsin's drone was flying overhead to do a bomb damage assessment to see what other targets of opportunity there were. The Iraqi soldiers on the ground, demoralized after the bombardment, heard the drone overhead, believed it meant that a second bombardment was incoming, and famously came out of their bunkers and trenches waving white flags to surrender to the drone. This is the first, and I believe remains the only, declassified at least, instance of troops surrendering to an unmanned vehicle. That drone was famous enough to be accepted into the Smithsonian's collection and can be viewed when it's out on display. Battleship New Jersey would love to raise money to acquire our own RPV drone to display. We do not currently have one. As you can see, many of our drone-related facilities were stripped clear when the ship was decommissioned. Thanks for watching today. Remember to like, share, and subscribe so you're notified when we put out new content. If you got any questions about this, or worked with the drone program and have any additional information you can give us, leave them in the comment section down below. Check the description below for ways you can donate. Battleship New Jersey is in some financial trouble right now, and we are raising money to continue to run our YouTube channel after the museum closes on Labor Day. So if you are able to support the channel, check the description down below for links to our GoFundMe campaign to help keep us creating content through the closure.